Jesus looks at it as, you know, preparing him, anointing him was a good thing. But some of the disciples, especially Judas, the treasurer, the purse keeper, was most offended by that. And it says, the last part of verse 5, and they scolded her. I mean, have you ever been scolded for doing something good? For doing something to help somebody, And I mean, you think you're doing the right thing, the good thing, and you find out, well, I guess that wasn't what I was supposed to do at all. Or at least that's what some people think. But, Jesus was anointed. And Jesus says, let her alone. She did what was right. Why do you trouble her? And, and then this line in verse 7, you have always will have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. And that's true. I mean, there are people in our communities, in our area, always that need help. And sometimes we get feeling bombarded, feeling overwhelmed by people that are asking for help or needing help and wondering, well, why don't they better themselves somehow? And it's part of the way life is that there are people that struggle. And part of what we are to do as people of God, just as people in general, is to help those less fortunate. That's part of Jesus saying, and God saying, love your neighbor as yourself. And he says you can show them kindness whenever you wish. And then, but the next thing he says, you will not always have me. And Jesus isn't going to be living on earth with them, for very much longer. But the reality is that we always have Jesus. I mean, we trust that by faith, that Jesus walks with us. And, it's a song in the garden, that he walks with me and he talks with me. And, he's there. So we do have Jesus, but not in a physical presence. And that was what Jesus was meaning. You will not always have me, but we have Jesus with us always. And then he says about this woman, she has anointed my body beforehand for burial. I mean, he's told his disciples quite plainly what's going to happen. And part of their denial, part of their not wanting this to happen, I mean, they wouldn't like to hear Jesus say those words either. She has prepared my body for burial. I mean, he's living and he's breathing and he's right there with him. I mean, why would he be talking about his burial, And it just doesn't make sense to them. And then verse 10 rather, is the beginning of the end for Jesus. Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him. And it says, when they heard it, they were greatly pleased. I mean, this chapter started with that the chief priests and the scribes were looking for a way to arrest him with stealth. And here comes Judas, ready to betray him into their hands. They were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity. And, it's just, so this is 2 days before the Passover festival. And all of this is happening. And then verse 12, on the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said, where should we go and prepare the Passover feast? And, I think it's very intentional that the gospel writer Mark put in there when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, because of, the upcoming sacrifice of Jesus for all of us. But it's a reminder that, before the Passover feast happens, before we can celebrate and remember, I don't know if I should say celebrate, but the people were to remember that the angel of death had passed over their houses. And we don't celebrate other people's misfortune, but they were to remember on this yearly basis. They were to gather for this festival of the Passover. And before they could observe the Passover, they had to sacrifice the proper lamb. And so again, it's just one more subtle way that we know that Jesus is going to be sacrificed. So they're going to go to make preparations for him to eat the Passover, and the Passover meal is very, very intentional of what to eat and what there is there, and of how the customs, the traditions, and the tradition of the Passover meal is still to this day very important for the Jewish people, and it's, some people find it uncomfortable, to have a Passover meal, and I've done it with confirmation kids many different times, and it's, often it's, ooh, I don't want to eat that, or what is that, and all of those things, and just because it's something different. But it's, for the Jewish people, these were common foods, ordinary things for them to eat. But they go to prepare, and two of the disciples go into the city, and they come back, or they go into the city. I just turned 2 pages again, and it says, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you, and wherever he goes, say to the owner of the house. So a servant is gathering, or bringing water to his household, and Jesus says, he'll go and talk to the owner of the house and say to them this, the teacher, or maybe the rabbi, says, where may I eat my Passover with my disciples? And so this man shows them this large room upstairs. And so this is the room that Jesus and his disciples have the Passover meal in. And this is the room that after the resurrection, the disciples are gathered in, and Jesus suddenly appears. So, and that's getting ahead of the story, but we know that this is the same area. So the disciples make the preparations there, and that evening he came with it says he came with the 12. So maybe these first 2 that went weren't 2 of the disciples. It says he sent 2 of his disciples, and then Jesus came with the 12, and this is the night that he instituted Holy Communion, and he talked with them beforehand about that one would betray him, and even though he knew that Judas was going to betray him, he served Judas the bread and the wine as well. And so this is, the words of institution here in Mark are very brief. Jesus, it's just a couple verses. While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, blessed it, broke it, gave it to them. This is, take, this is my body. Take, this is my, drink this is my blood. That Jesus comes to us in that body and blood. And we celebrate Holy Communion. We celebrate that Jesus comes to us that way. We look at Holy Communion as that celebration, but also remembering that the pain and the agony that came to Jesus for us, that he might give us that body and blood. We know that just as the Passover lamb had to be killed for the sacrifice, and then so that the people would be able to eat this Passover meal, Jesus died on the cross for you and for me, so that we can eat the Passover meal, Holy Communion.